Well, greetings to all of you. Good Shabbos. Happy Sabbath. And today I'd like to continue in the book of Leviticus. This is the year of release. It's a year when we release debts and when things seem to be kind of balanced out. It's a special Sabbath year at the end of which the entire Torah was to be expounded, or it is to be, expounded at the end of this year, so at the Feast of Sukkot. So we will be doing that, but we're going to continue kind of studying through the Torah as we get ready for the main push toward the end of this year. Today we are going to pick it up where we left off in Leviticus 11. Before I read that, I would just like to make one brief point here in chapter 10 and verse 3, when it says, Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Eternal spoke, saying, by those who come near to me I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people I must be glorified." This is because they had been offering, Aaron's sons had offered strange incense, strange fire, actually. And they put together the incense and they burned it in a way, in a manner that was inappropriate. They just didn't take things seriously, I guess. I don't know. At any rate, it was a tragic mistake, and there was a great loss. But God says, those who come near me need to realize I am a holy God. We don't just want to come before God flippantly. This was one of the things, if you're going to minister as priests, and we are all called to be kings and priests, that we would regard God very highly with awe and respect and love and devotion, and glorify Him in all things. And again, the Eternal spoke to Aaron, verse 9, and said, "Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die." Again, you don't want to offer strange fire, but you don't want to go in there drunk, and you want, when you approach God in service, be careful of what state of mind you're in, that you have control of your faculties. It's a nice thing to be able to enjoy a glass of wine. It's a nice thing to be able to enjoy a bottle of wine. It's a nice thing to have a hard drink from time to time. That's fine, but when you are going to go in before God's service, I don't drink any wine or any alcohol at all if I'm in God's service, if I'm going to do any teaching or writing or anything in God's service. And God must be approached in a way where we are able to regard Him as holy and glorify Him and honor Him. This is a statute of God, verse 9. And so that we would distinguish between holy and unholy. It's important to do that, and it's important to be able to do that. And that we would be able to distinguish between clean and unclean, verse 10. That's important. And that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Eternal has spoken to them by the hand of Moshe. All the statutes. To be able to distinguish between clean and unclean, holy and unholy, and teach the statutes. So this is what we're getting ready for now in chapter 11. In Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 1, the Eternal spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the animals which you may eat among all the beasts that are on the earth." Now, it seems like it's all of a sudden just, okay, he's talking about offering strange fire and make sure that you don't drink, and then all of a sudden he goes into the unclean meats. Now, I'd like to share something with you again over in Deuteronomy. We'll come back to Leviticus in a moment, but in Deuteronomy chapter 1, and verse 5. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 5. On this side of the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moshe began to explain this Torah, saying. So when we have the book of Deuteronomy, understand the book of Deuteronomy is to explain the laws that came before it. It is to explain the book of Leviticus. The book of Deuteronomy is to explain what you find in Numbers. It's to explain what you find in Exodus. It's to explain it. So that's why many times you will find in the book of Deuteronomy things are worded just a little differently when it's a parallel account to a statute in Leviticus, or the order of things is a little different because Deuteronomy is given to interpret the others. And so, again, the context that we were at in Leviticus 11, men put the chapter breaks in there that were not in the original scroll. Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 10 were not differentiated by a chapter break. It's not like we think in English, a paragraph, a new chapter, a new subject, That whole English way of thinking is not applicable in the Bible. And it's important for us to understand that so that we can receive truth properly in its context. So the context of Leviticus 11 is given in the context of chapter 10. So now let's look at the parallel account in Deuteronomy of these statutes. Well, we'll do that in just a moment. I'll read a few verses from Leviticus 11, and then we'll look at the parallel account, and we'll see that context. The Eternal spoke in Leviticus 11, verse 1, to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Among all the beasts, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud. Those that have cloven hooves, that like the camel, because it chews the cud, but it does not have cloven hooves. It is unclean to you. There's the rock hyrax, because it chews the cud, but it doesn't have cloven hooves. It's unclean to you. There's the hare or the rabbit. Rabbits chew the cud, but they don't have cloven hooves. They are unclean. The swine, it divides the hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud. It's unclean to you. The flesh of these you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you." So they are unclean. Remember, he was talking about that you may discern in chapter 10 between the clean and the unclean, one of the last things that was said in chapter 10. So this is the context. Now let's look at the parallel account to these passages in Deuteronomy. And let's go to Deuteronomy then, chapter 14. Deuteronomy chapter 14. It says, "You are the children of the eternal your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead, because you are a holy people for the eternal your God. And the Eternal has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." You're a special people. God's holy, and you need to learn to be holy, to be in his presence. It's kind of what he's talking. God has chosen you. You are special. You are to be different. You are to act different. You are to eat different. You are to dress differently. You are to be different people. You are a special treasure. You shall not eat anything that is detestable. So he kind of spends a little bit more time explaining that than what it does in Leviticus. Now, it goes on here. "These are the animals that you may eat." Instead of just going right into it, if it chews the cud and splits the hoof, he actually gives a list of animals. The deer. "These are the animals which you may eat." Verse 4. "The ox. The sheep." When it says the ox, it means all the family of the oxen, the ox family. There are a lot of different types of oxen, a lot of different types of cows, You have the Texas Longhorns, and, the Guernsey, the Jersey, there are a lot of different cows. You can eat them all. They chew the cud, they part the hoof. You may eat as many of the different types of oxen as you would like. The sheep. You may eat sheep. Goats, you may eat the goat. Deer, yes, you can go eat deer. The gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the mountain goat, the antelope, mountain sheep. So it gives you a list. And you may eat every animal with cloven hooves, having the hoof split into two parts, that chews the cud among the animals. Nevertheless, those that chew the cud or have cloven hooves you shall not eat, such as these: the camel, the hare, the rock hyrax. They chew the cud, but they don't have cloven hooves. Also, the swine is unclean to you, because it has cloven hooves, yet it does not chew the cud. You shall not eat their flesh or touch their dead carcasses. So he gives a little more explanation. Now, before I go into, the principle of, I got to fix my deal here. Sorry, just a moment. There we go. So before I get into the passages talking about the New Testament application of these statutes, I'd like to just kind of point out another aspect, something else for us to consider here. You have two different sets of laws concerning clean and unclean animals, if you will. Probably the truth is there'd be more than that if you really looked at all the different, ways that people interpret things. But you have what I call being biblically kosher, and then you have what, rabbinically kosher. So to be biblically kosher means you'd be kosher to go out in the woods and, you'd hunt typically back like in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where they primarily used arrows. And they would keep their quiver full of arrows, and they'd go out and hunt, and they'd shoot a deer with an arrow. They were bow hunters. Sometimes they would use a spear, but you have to be very close with a spear. That was not typically a successful way to go. So you could use an arrow, and you could fling that arrow from behind the bush and sneak up, and, so they would shoot an arrow. Now, here's the thing. Isaac said, "You know how much I love that venison stew," to his son, right? Esau. "Go out and get me another deer. I'd like some venison stew. Prepare me some stew." It was very common. So here's the thing. If you want to be kosher, then you can go out in the woods and you could shoot a deer with a bow. You could shoot a deer with a gun. You could poke him with a spear. And, you got your deer. He's dead. You clean it, drain the blood, and you eat it. And that is biblically kosher. But to be rabbinically kosher, well, you have to slit the throat, and that's the means of its death. You have to slit the throat and then drain the blood, and things have to be done in the prescribed way, or it's not kosher. And so they have, they go to the different slaughterhouses, and the rabbis have to certify it that they're doing things according to the kosher manner, and the animals are, run through, and they slit their necks, and, has to be done in the kosher way. So I guess if you want to believe that, if you want to only follow that, and that's what you want to do, that's fine. Hey, because the Bible doesn't say it's wrong to eat things that are rabbinically kosher. Obviously, it's perfectly fine to eat things that are rabbinically kosher. As a matter of fact, I do it all the time. But I also eat some things that are not rabbinically kosher, but I always eat biblically kosher. I just wanted to point out that there is a difference. How would you, let's just say it says that you can eat a deer. It says the antelope. Antelope are the most skittish, I think, of the wild animals. I've spent a lot of time out in the woods with such critters, and I know how they act, and they each have their own personality. An antelope, you need to get a long-range firearm for that, because they don't let you get anywhere nearly as close as deer do, and they're much more skittish, much more fearful, and they're frankly much faster. And so anyway, how would you be able to get your game if you had to slit its throat? I guess you could go out there, run it down, jump on his back, tackle it, and hold it down and slit his throat. Then you could be biblically kosher. So maybe what I'm just not getting is how fast Esau could run. Maybe that's the deal. He was very quick, faster than a deer, faster than a gazelle, faster than the antelope, and he could just run him down so that he could kill it in the kosher manner, and then Isaac could eat it. Or you would have to say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and indeed all the people until modern age, ate in an unkosher manner. All of the holy men like Elijah and David, etc., they ate unkosher food. You have to either accept one or the other. I just wanted to point out that, hey, being kosher food is good, you know, and they make sure everything's done in a clean environment and all that. But to keep a kosher kitchen means a different thing to different people. And I teach the Bible. I'm not here to teach traditions of men. I'm not here to teach church doctrine. I'm not here to teach rabbinical doctrine. I'm here to teach Torah. So all of those animals are available to be eaten, and it would be clean for you. But you can't catch them and slit their throat in the kosher way. So rabbinically, they would be unclean. And so that's, I don't know how they deal with these scriptures. Maybe they just say, well, things changed. That was before the law of Moses. There's always some way to come up with an excuse. But, okay, what about David? You really think David would run him down? And, you know, it's the same thing. So it's a problem. Anyway, I wanted to point that out. So these are all the animals that are available to eat. Now, we'll go back to where we were in the context in Leviticus then. In Leviticus chapter 11, if they chew the cud and part the hoof, they would be clean. Verse 9, these you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whatever in the seas or in the rivers, if it has fins and scales, that you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, again, it's just like they have to have both, just like with the chew the cud and part the hoof. They have to have both. Fins and scales, all that move in the water, or any living thing, such as clams, you know, or oysters or things like that that wouldn't move in the water. Any living thing which is in the water, mussel or whatever, etc., they are an abomination to you, a detestable thing. They are unclean to you. Don't eat those things and then pray to God. It's like, don't come before me in a detestable manner. That was the context that it's given in. He was just correcting the children of Aaron for coming before God, and hey, I must be regarded as holy. Think about the way you conduct yourself before you come before God's presence. That's the context that it's given in. We are to be a holy people, a special people, because we have a holy God, a special God. So we don't want to go become an abomination and then go before God. Then he doesn't like that. So he says they would be an abomination to you, verse 11. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Verse 12, whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. Okay, just don't eat them. They're fine. You can like them, and just don't eat them. Now, with the fish, it gives you very clear guidelines. Fins and scales. You know, some people will argue, well, how many scales? Because there are some fish that have just a little patch of scales on each side, right by the gills, and that's it. The rest of their skin is smooth. So people want to worry about that. Hey, if it has scales, it has scales, okay? It has to have more than a scale. It has to have plural scales. If it has fins and scales, it's clean. If you want to let the rabbi tell you, then that's fine too. I really don't care. I'm just teaching what the Bible says. So scales and fins. And then if it chews the cud, that's very clear and has a parted hoof, that's very clear. So it has to have those categories. But when it comes to the birds, there are no such categories. It doesn't give you that kind of a category. So it says, these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds, verse 13. They shall not be eaten, they are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, and the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon, after its kind, or after their kind. So all the birds that are after these kinds. So there's categories. It gives you categories of birds. Falcons, and that mean everything after the kind. So that'd be like, I don't know what there are various different types of falcons, numerous different types of falcons. There are hawks, there are numerous different types of owls. There are numerous different types of eagles, etc. So after its kind, every raven after its kind, every kind of a blackbird. Every kind of a raven, blackbird, would be considered unclean. Everything after its kind. Now in verse 16, the ostrich. I'm reading from a New King James translation. Some other translations, it might read the great owl, or it might say the long-eared owl. So that is the correct translation, the long-eared owl. Why do some translate it ostrich? I don't know. I have no idea why sometimes they translate things in such a manner. But if you want to look up the word, it's categorized. Strong was very good about categorizing all the words. And the number for that word ostrich is number 3284. And you can look it up. And the meaning is the great owl or the long-eared owl. That is the literal translation. Why they would translate a great owl or a long-eared owl as ostrich? Maybe that somebody saw an owl that was so big they thought it was as big as an ostrich. I don't know. I really don't know. But I just know this. I don't have any problem at all eating an ostrich. Okay, because I'm interested in being biblically kosher. But if you have a problem with that, well, don't eat it. I don't have a problem with it. I've eaten ostrich before, and I don't care. It tastes fine. But the word is not ostrich. You just look it up. Every raven after its kind is unclean. But the owl, the great owl, or the long-eared owl, don't eat the owls. Nothing of the owl family. The short-eared owl. So here, that's what makes sense. Look at the context. You have the long-eared owl, and then the very next one is the short-eared owl. It's because it's talking about everything in a category. So it's really silly that all of a sudden they'd call it an ostrich. But it's talking about the long-eared owl, and then the next one it says the short-eared owl. Also the seagull and the hawk after its kind. And then the little owl, and the fisher owl, and the screech owl, and the white owl, and the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, and the stork, and the heron. Around here we have the blue heron. After its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Those are all unclean. So now here again then, some church leaders and also some churches and also the Jews have set themselves, actually I think mostly what happened is the churches copied the Jews, is really the truth of it. But the Jews have set up a process where they have said all of these animals that are clean, let's try to categorize this, because they like the way God did it for, it's got to chew the cud, part the hoof, has got to have fins and scales. So they wanted to try to come up with categories for birds to do the same thing. So they came up with a list of, I think, 7 different things that birds that are considered clean must have in order to be kosher. It must have a gizzard, a double lining. I don't know. They came up with you'd have to get the list. I don't remember them all. But the ostrich doesn't have one of the things. It has everything that is required in this list except for one. It doesn't have, it has to have a rear, oh no, it has to have some way to perch or something like that. I just don't remember all the laws. If you can remember them all, then you just got a much better memory than I do, because they do have a lot of extra rules and regulations in certain things. But it doesn't really matter to me, because I just don't live by it. I just remember when I was studying into it, that ostrich met 6 out of the 7 criteria, but it doesn't have the ability to perch. It doesn't have a rear toe or prong back there. And I was thinking about that. Ostriches weigh 300 to 400 pounds. It's like, man alive, I'm really glad that they don't have a rear, because if they could perch in a tree, wow. If I've been driving around and had bird droppings on my car, it's like you wouldn't want to park under that tree. I'll tell you, it could be dangerous. So anyway, I guess that's enough on that. But the ostrich is not the name. It's the great owl, the long-eared owl, the short-eared owl. And they came up with all of these different categories of birds. Now, but then they themselves have, I don't know if they make certain exceptions, because I think ducks and geese are considered clean, but they don't meet all of those requirements because they don't have that rear tongue or toe to perch with either. I guess they're wood ducks. Wood ducks can actually perch in a tree, but most ducks can't, but yet they're considered clean. So that, maybe they made an exception. I'm not a student of rabbinical Judaism sufficient to be able to comment much further on that. I'll leave that for those who are interested in such things. So anyway, it goes on, but otherwise you could just look at the list and you could say, okay, here's a list, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and it's very simple and very easy. You got the eagle, everything after its kind, vultures, anything that's related to a vulture or a buzzard, the kite, falcon, in other words, all the birds of prey that fly around and attack other birds from the air, the birds of prey, things that are related to those types of birds, and hawks and that kind of thing. With owls, again, same thing, seagulls, and the raven, after those kind, the stork, the heron, those things after their kind, those categories of birds you don't eat. Anything that's not listed in that category, if I'm hungry, I'll eat it. So that means songbirds would be fine. You could go down the list. There's a lot of birds that are perfectly just fine to eat. If you want to talk about something that's unclean, you'd think, man, you ever seen what a chicken eats? It's like, whoa. But chickens are clean. So people want to add their own rules and their own laws, and that's fine if that's what people want to do. But I'm personally nervous about that, because I read in the book of Deuteronomy where it says, you shall not add to the words that are in this book, nor shall you take away from the words that are in this book. So I don't like to, that's why I like to be biblically kosher. Just leave it at that. Keep it simple. Anything that's not listed here in these categories of a bird is perfectly fine to eat. All flying insects, verse 20, that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat, of every flying insect that creeps on all fours. Those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. Hoppers, in other words. These you may eat. The locust after its kind. The destroying locust after its kind. The cricket after its kind. The grasshopper after its kind. And so all of those insects that fly, but they also have the rear legs and with a hinged leg in such a way that they can hop and leap, they're okay. Now here's where it gets kind of strange. Today in our culture, we don't really want to eat these bugs. Most people are not really interested. Hey, would you like a bowl of crickets? I think I'll pass. Most people are not interested in having a bowl of crickets for breakfast. But it just, and that's fine. I'm not trying to talk you ladies into having a bowl of crickets. But it is an interesting thing to consider how we get imprinted by the world standards and what we grow up with and what we get used to and what we think is good, what we think is kosher, what we like, what we're comfortable with. And that becomes our standard. And that becomes even our moral compass. And many people would feel much more comfortable eating a pork chop than they would a grasshopper or a cricket or a bowl of them. And many people would feel much more comfortable doing all kinds of things, but they would really not want to eat a cricket or a grasshopper. And just consider that. We are a holy people. Who gets to decide what is holy and what is clean? And God gets to decide that. So we all get imprinted. I understand. Just something to consider. So, by these you shall become unclean, verse 24. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. You know, people talk about, then you're unclean until evening. You have to go out of the camp. Well, you know what? It doesn't say that. It just says you're unclean until evening. It's only until nighttime. And it was only ceremonial. You didn't have to go out of the camp. You didn't have to go anywhere. It just meant you couldn't eat any of the holy food that was from temple. You couldn't go into the tabernacle, until evening. That's all. Just a real short period of time. You could live in your camp, come home to your wife. Everything was fine. You just couldn't go into tabernacle or eat special holy food or serve in some prescribed way until that evening. One part of one day, that's it. And so it wasn't that big of a deal. Of course, now we know, and I'll get to that in a little bit, that we're all cleansed and once and for all through the blood of Yeshua. And so nobody is considered common or unclean this way anymore. But I wanted to just explain this. That doesn't mean that we can now eat pork. It just means that when somebody touches a carcass or something, and they would be ceremonially unclean, and God is cleansed. We'll get to that in a little bit. So whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. I used to think about these scriptures when I was a chef in a restaurant. And boy, I did not like making escargot. It was so gross, and I felt unclean until evening. I just didn't like putting those little snails down in the carcass of any beast which divides the foot, but is not cloven hoofed, or does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it would be unclean, and whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass would wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you. These also shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, etc. These are all unclean to you among the things that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead, there's a difference between when they're dead and when they're alive, they are unclean until evening. Anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether any be an item of food or clothing. It must be put in water, and it would be unclean until evening, and then it would be clean. So it goes on, the earthen vessel, and it talks about a few things like that. If there's plenty of water, if something falls in the water, it would be unclean. If it's a running stream, it's okay. And it gives you some of the specific statutes regarding these things. In verse 42, whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, whatever has many feet among all creeping things, in other words, all the bugs, all the insects on the earth, these you shall not eat. They are an abomination. And you shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, nor shall you make yourselves unclean with them. lest you be defiled by them, because I am Yahweh your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Those things are unclean, and they are not holy, and they are not sanctified. And so he doesn't want us to eat them. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Eternal, who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is Torah. This is the law of the beasts and the birds and every living creature that moves in the waters, of every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. Now, people have understood this, and yet some have said, well, we're cleansed from all that because it was shown to Peter when the scroll was let down that, he was told to rise and eat. And there were all kinds of unclean beasts that once Messiah came, spilled his blood, all those animals have been cleansed, and now anybody can eat anything. So let's just look at that for a minute. That's found in Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. We'll go to the Brit Hadashah, and let's look at this in Acts chapter 10 just briefly. Acts chapter 10. Peter was in Joppa. There was a certain, chapter 10, verse 1, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. So he's an Italian. He's a Gentile. He was not a Hebrew. And he was a devout man, and he was one who feared God, very righteous Gentile. He feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. And about the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And so he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa, send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He's lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. He will tell you what you must do. And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, Cornelius called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who waited on him continually. And when he had explained all these things to them, he sent them to Joppa. And the next day, as they were on their journey, and they drew near to the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. In other words, it would about noon. And when he became very hungry, he wanted to eat. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance. So he's in a trance now. He's got this vision that he sees, and he saw heaven opened in this trance, and he saw an object like a great sheet bound at the 4 corners descending to him and let down to the earth. And in it were all kinds of 4-footed animals of the earth. There were wild beasts, there were creeping things, there were birds. And a voice came to him and said, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But there were a lot of creeping things and a lot of unclean animals in there. But Peter said, Not so, Lord. I have never eaten anything common or unclean. I've never done that. So I said, No, I'm not. No. And a voice spoke to him again a second time. What God has cleansed, you must not call common. So does that mean that God has cleansed the pig now? And God has cleansed the stork and the heron, and he's cleansed the eagle, and you can eat raven and blackbirds now? I've known people that have eaten blackbirds, and they say the meat is quite disgusting tasting. It didn't surprise me. But, okay, well, let's just consider it. I used to know a man when I was young, and he would come to work. It seems like about once a week he would come to work, and he would just be groaning and complaining. And after, talking about how bad he felt. And after a while, because he just, we're working in construction together, and he'd be talking, and he'd kind of reveal his whole life to us after a couple hours. He'd start talking about what he had done the day before, and I started to notice a pattern. Every time he came to work with a bellyache, the previous day he had eaten one of these kinds of critters. Once he's like, yeah, no, we went out and shot a couple squirrels and fried them up. I felt so bad. Next time he's feeling bad, I finally started asking him. He'd always either eaten squirrel meat, or a lot of times he'd catch snakes and eat snakes. One time he'd telling me how he killed and ate a rattlesnake. And it's like, but I feel, but he never could connect the dots. It was funny. But, hey, is that what it's saying, that you can eat rattlesnake meat now? You think that's what it says? God's cleansed the Messiah died to clean the pig? This was done 3 times, verse 16, and the object was taken up into heaven. Now Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant. So now here, this is an interesting thing. Here's the Apostle Peter, and he has this vision, and he just went through it. He just experienced it. Not only that, he had spent the previous 3.5 years of his life personally hand-to-hand with Yeshua himself, right? It's like a huge advantage over us. And here's a man that has this huge advantage over us, has this vision, and he's thinking, I wonder what that means. 2,000 years later, people that don't have that advantage, who didn't spend 3.5 years with Yeshua, who were not the Apostle Peter, they're like, hey, I know what that means. It means you can eat pig meat now. And you can eat your cat when it gets old. Really? Well, let's see. It's amazing how people are so much smarter than Peter was. That's cool. I commend all of you smart people out there who are just like that. That's great. I'm not as smart as Peter, personally. But Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant. Behold, so he's like, I'm trying to figure this out. I understand the Messiah said, don't think I came to change Torah, because Peter remembered that. That's over in Matthew chapter 5 when it says, don't even think it, that I came to change any law in Torah. I didn't come to change the slightest jot or tittle. What, Matthew 5, verses 17, verse 18, verse 19. Don't even think I came to change Torah. Oh, but other people 2,000 years later will say, you know what, he didn't actually mean that. He did change Torah, and here's proof. Peter could eat those pigs now. But Peter didn't jump to that conclusion because he knew that would go contrary to what Messiah himself had personally taught Peter. So he's contemplating on that. And they called, while Peter was wondering, verse 18, they called and they asked whether Simon, whose surname was Peter, was lodging there. So he's up there cogitating, and all of a sudden these men arrive. Cornelius had sent. In verse 18, they called and asked whether Simon, whose surname was Peter, was lodging, and while Peter thought about the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are seeking you. Arise, therefore, go down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. Why would it need to say that, doubting nothing, for I have sent them? Well, because Peter was a Jew, and the Italians were not Jews. And Jews and non-Jews, I'm not going to invite them into my house or go into their house. That's not what they did. And so the angel had to tell him, don't doubt anything. Don't worry about it. Because otherwise he's like, I'm not going to do that. But the angel told him, don't worry about it. I have sent them. Then Peter went down with the men who had been sent to him from Cornelius, verse 21, and he said, yes, I am he whom you seek. For what reason have you come? And they said, Cornelius the centurion, a just man, one who fears God and has a good reputation among all the nation of the Jews. He was divinely instructed by an holy angel to summon you to his house and to hear words from you. And he invited them, and he lodged with them. And on the next day Peter went away with them, and some brethren from Joppa accompanied him. And the following day they entered Caesarea, and Cornelius was waiting for them. And he had called together his relatives and all his close friends. He said, come on over, you guys. I've got a Jew coming over to talk to us, and his name is Kepha. It was the apostle Peter in English. And so as Peter was coming in, verse 25, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, stand up. I myself am also a man. I'm a man. I'm just a man like every other man. And as he talked with him, he went in and found many who had come together. And then here's what the apostle Kepha said that vision that he received meant. This is what Peter said it meant. I'm not telling you what all the Christian churches say it meant. I'm telling you what the apostle Peter said it meant. Then he said to them, you know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or to go to one another, to one of another nation. You know, to go to a Gentile of another nation like that. That's why the angel said, don't doubt anything, just go to him. You know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with a non-Jew or to go to somebody of another nation like that. But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. You see, the Gentiles were considered common or unclean prior to that. And so this was to teach Peter that it was important for him to take the good news to the Gentiles. Because Yeshua died to save them just as much as he died to save the house of Israel. And that we are all cleansed and saved by the blood of Messiah. The Jews already had the type. All they had, though, was the type, oxen and sheep and goats, spilling the blood of goats. It's never possible for goat blood to cleanse you of your sin. The apostle makes that clear in the book of Hebrews. That was a type that pointed to the Lamb of God. So they had the Messiah, but now it's being shown that Messiah's blood also will atone for the sins of the Gentiles. And the Jews should not call any man common or unclean. Therefore, I came without objection as soon as I was sent for. I mean, that's why I came, because of that vision. It's because of that vision. That's why I came to you. I realized he's saying men, people, women, children of the Gentiles are not called, common or unclean. They have been cleansed by the blood of Yeshua. So it's a pretty silly thing to try to say that that it is applying to pigs, because Peter himself said it. No, it was saying I shouldn't call man common. Therefore I came without objection. In verse 33, he said, Cornelius says, I sent to you immediately, and you've done well to come. Now, therefore, we are all present before God to hear all the things commanded you by God. And Peter opened his mouth and said, in truth, verse 34, I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears God and works righteousness is accepted by God. It doesn't matter if you're a Hebrew or not. If you are living righteously, that is commendable with God, and God will hear your prayers. Now, what is righteousness? Is there a different category of righteousness for the Jew than there is for the Gentile? The Bible gives us the definition of righteousness. All thy commandments are righteousness, David said. And God in Torah, in the statutes, right? Moses said, if you keep these statutes, it will be righteousness unto you. And in the Psalms, it says, the entirety of your Torah is righteousness. So, all thy statutes are righteousness. So, when the Gentiles begin to live those righteous laws, they are not unrighteous, they are righteous. And that's what the Apostle Paul was explaining in Romans, that a Jew who's circumcised but doesn't keep the righteous requirements of the law, but a Gentile, he says, who is not circumcised but does fulfill the righteous requirements of the law, is more righteous than the Jew. That's what Paul said. That makes perfect sense in line with what Peter was saying. We'll go back to Leviticus chapter 11 and continue. So we understand that Yeshua from the book of Hebrews and other places, that Yeshua is the sacrifice once and for all. So we don't have to worry about being unclean until evening anymore. Messiah was that sacrifice that cleanses so that no man is common or unclean anymore. And if you touch something, you just pray to God and say, forgive me, cleanse me, let the blood of Messiah apply. You are clean. Go about your business. Don't worry about it. But does that mean that you just say and start eating unclean things, thinking, well, I'll just eat cat meat and repent? Or well, you don't have to repent. It's okay now. I'll just eat cat meat and just the blood of Messiah will cleanse me? It's not what it says. It's not what it says at all. So, in the rest of this chapter pretty much continues between the clean and the unclean, animals that may be eaten and animals which may not be eaten. Then we go into Leviticus chapter 12. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a woman is conceived and she bore a male child, she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification for 33 days. So 7 days and 33 days, that's 40 days altogether. Now, if she bears a female, then it would be 2 weeks and 66 days, exactly twice as long. Why the difference between the males for 40 days and the females for 80 days? I don't know. So we'll just move on to the next point. I just don't know. I could sit here and try to guess and make up stuff and try to sound smart, but, I really don't understand why there's the difference, okay? I don't know. Maybe somebody else does, and that's great. But there was a difference, and I'm sure it has important meaning, but since we understand that Messiah has cleansed us all, women don't have to be put out of the camp during their menstruation anymore. If a man has an issue of blood, you don't call any man common or unclean. Messiah has fulfilled that. It's not that the law's changed. It's the sacrifice has been made. The cleansing is done. It's done once and for all. The statutes were fulfilled. The judgments were fulfilled through the blood of the Lamb. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, verse 6, a son or a daughter, she would bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon, or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and he shall offer it before the Eternal to make atonement for her, and she shall be clean from her flow of blood. This is the law. So Messiah fulfilled that once and for all, and I'm grateful for that, so that we still keep the laws, but the laws regarding purification, ceremonial cleanliness, we don't do that anymore, because Messiah was that lamb that atoned once and for all. So the ceremonial things he has fulfilled. He didn't do away with them. He fulfilled them. But just because I'm forgiven of my sins, shall I go out and start robbing? Shall I steal? Shall I lie? Of course not. I don't want to do the very things that killed my Savior, that he had to die to pay the price on my behalf, and then just keep doing it. That would be mockery. I have no interest in that. So he continues, chapter 13. Now we get into the laws of leprosy. Again, we have the same principle that Messiah died once and for all. That was a type, and he has cleansed us. So these things are not in application today in the same way, but there is an important principle that I would like to point out here in Leviticus chapter 13. When a man has, verse 2, on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, he would be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest would look at the sore of the skin of his body. And if the hair of the sore has turned white, or if the sore appears deeper than the skin, it is leprous, it's a leprous sore. Then the priest would look at him and pronounce him unclean. Now it says, when a man has this, problem, that he would be brought to the Aaron or the priests. So he would come voluntarily. If he's not going to go voluntarily, what do? Well, then you bring him involuntarily. So they had laws of quarantine. That's the point. Now, I know for many, many times throughout history, the Jews have followed these laws of quarantine and clean and unclean. And when diseases have come and wiped out whole communities, the Jews have oftentimes been left largely alone. And I know that it has even caused quite a bit of consternation with their neighbors because, you guys must maybe, there's always a conspiracy. You got to find somebody to blame, So sometimes the Jews were blamed. Why didn't this hurt you? So that's just a natural human reaction, I guess. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes because of the quarantine laws and laws of washing and cleanliness and things like this, it has saved the Jewish communities from a lot of the plagues that have come through various nations and killed a lot of people. And so there's something to be said about the principle of quarantine, and it was not a voluntary thing. Well, I got my rights. The man with leprosy could say, I have my rights. Who are you to tell me? Well, that wasn't allowed. Quarantine meant quarantine. You like it or you can not like it. It doesn't change it. They would be brought before the priest. Now, another thing, too, that we should understand, this doesn't apply in principle that, okay, well, bring him before the minister then. Bring him to the pastor. Let him decide. You know what? That is not applicable because the priests were trained. They had high education. They had a lot of training that would go in before they were allowed to become a priest. Not only did they have to be of the priestly line, but they were trained and prepared from their youth for that responsibility. And when they got to that point, they were well-versed. And they were well-versed not only in Torah, but they were well-versed in things concerning finance and concerning, things like health issues and medical issues and numerous things that people don't realize. They had to go through a lot of schooling, and they were trained and prepared so that they could do it. I'm not trained and prepared for that today, And, I don't know of any pastors or ministers who are capable of doing it. I just don't know of any. Today, it would be more something for the medical community. But the principle of quarantining, I think, is applicable for us. If you're sick, if you're coughing and sneezing and you feel like I'm getting a cold, I'm getting sick, stay home. Don't go out and start spreading it down at the grocery store and sneezing in the supermarket or the restaurant or coming to synagogue or a temple or a place of worship and getting other people sick. Quarantine. That was a biblical principle. It was an oracle of God. And we can certainly see the application of that, even though Yeshua cleanses us, and we understand, today I don't even think leprosy is an issue so much anymore, and sometimes they have drugs and they can deal with things in different ways, and I respect that, and that's fantastic, and I'm grateful for it. But things that are contagious, the law provides for quarantine to protect so you don't have the spread of contagious diseases. Just things that are contagious. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. That's a biblical principle. So that kind of covers us through Leviticus chapter 13, covers us for Leviticus 14. I just don't want to take the time right now to go through those things. There are bits and pieces of jewels in there, which I've shared with you along the way. But in Leviticus 14 and verse 54, it says, "This is the law for any leprous sore or scall, for the leprosy of a garment or a house." They had laws if, material had leprosy in it or the material was rotting, and if your house had some kind of a growing infectious type, people that were experts would come in and would, that's unclean, that's dangerous for you. And so it was quarantined so that it wouldn't spread. Verse 57, to teach when it is unclean and when it is clean. And so that is the principle that I think is applicable as today. So, again, it goes through the same things, discharges from the body in chapter 15. This called the book of Leviticus. It was a book for the priests and the Levites who had to understand these things, and this was recorded for them. Then we have chapter 16, the Day of Atonement is inserted in there, and I covered that recently on Yom Kippur, so I don't want to take time to expound. There's a lot in chapter 16, but I'm going to skip over Leviticus 16 because we just covered that recently at Yom Kippur, and that brings us then to chapter 17, Leviticus chapter 17. And time-wise, let me see if I have time to go into chapter 17. Where's my time? It's about 10 minutes. Was that about 10 minutes ago? Is that probably about roughly right now? Okay, let me just take for just a moment and look at 17. Yeah, I'll go through chapter 17 and then we'll call it good. It won't take long on 17. So the Eternal spoke to Moshe, saying, Leviticus 17, verse 1, "Speak to Aaron and to his sons and all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing which the Eternal has commanded, saying, Whatever man of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, who kills it, or him who kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting to offer an offering, blood guilt would be imputed to that man." In other words, if it was intended for an offering and you make a sacrificial offering, then you can't just do it your own way and make the offering but not bring anything to the temple and say, well, I gave it to God, You have to do it the prescribed way. So that's what that's talking about. At the end, verse 5, that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, that they may bring them to the Eternal at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, to the priest, to offer them as peace offerings to the Eternal. There is a prescribed way. We can't just do it however we want. "And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Eternal and all the tabernacle. They shall no more offer their sacrifices," verse 7, "to demons, after whom they have played the harlot, This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. And you shall say to them, whatever man of the house of Israel or the strangers who sojourn among you, so that would be the Gentiles as well, so who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting it to offer it to the Eternal, that man would be cut off. And whatever man of the house of Israel or the Gentiles or the strangers who sojourn among them who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and I will cut him off from among his people. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Now this is a very deep passage right here in verse 11. It is a very deep passage indeed, and most people don't catch it. I thought I would just take a moment with that. Clearly, God is making a distinction between the flesh and the soul. The word soul is nephesh. The literal meaning is the inner essence of life, the inner man. You know, sometimes it's referred to as the heart, the soul, the inner man. Soul is the inner essence of life, and the soul has life independent of the body. The soul was created and put into a body, and the body is called a house or a tent, a body that the soul lives in. So it's kind of an interesting thing that the blood is given as an atonement for the soul. So we are all forgiven through the blood of Yeshua, but each of us dies. And when you die, your blood is the atonement for your soul. And yet, there are certain things that our blood simply will not atone for, and Yeshua's blood will. Yeshua's blood, the blood of his body, is the atonement for our soul. But also, people even that don't accept Yeshua, they die, their blood, their death, it's done, it's paid. Now, when Messiah brings them back, he will judge them and decide, at the resurrection, who is going to have life and not at his own time, and that's a much, much longer subject than I have time for today, but I just thought I'd put that teaser out for you to consider. The life of the flesh is in the blood. The blood circulates through the body. We breathe, and the lungs oxygenate the blood. Air is a type of the Holy Spirit, the breath of life. So we breathe the breath of life in, and that goes right into the blood. And that blood goes through every little crack and crevice of your body and brings life to it. And when we die, the blood was given to make atonement for our souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. And so God does not want us to eat blood because it is ceremonially a very important thing. He does not want us to eat blood because the life is in the blood, and it is given to make atonement for your souls. That is what the Bible says. It's an interesting thing. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood. And whatever man of the children of Israel or the stranger who sojourns among you who hunts and catches any animal or a bird that may be eaten, in other words, the ones that may be eaten, the ones that are clean, obviously, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. So if you're a farmer, a rancher, I should say, and you slaughter a cow or a goat or an ox, and you out in the field somewhere, you need to cover the blood with dust. That's what the Bible says. If you're a deer hunter and you go out and you're hunting deer, you're hunting elk, mountain goats, or whatever it is, and you take a goat or you take a deer and you drain the blood out as the Bible instructs us to, you shall not eat the blood, right? So you don't want to leave all the blood in the meat. Just drain it out. Now you have blood on the ground. Cover it with dust. That is the statute of God. That is what godly men and women do. It's important. Of anything that's clean. You slaughter a chicken, cover the blood. Now, if you I don't know, if you shoot a bear, it's an unclean animal. You don't have to cover the blood. You can shoot a bear in the woods and leave the blood there. But if it's clean, you bury it. That is the statute. Whatever man of the children of Israel, or the stranger, who sojourns among you, verse 13. So this law applies to Gentiles. Now, I just want to point this out. People say, well, the statutes don't apply to the Gentiles. Listen, please, to what God says. Don't listen to what I say. I'm not important. But I'm reading right from Torah here. Okay? This is a statute, and God specifically addresses the Gentiles in this statute. Whatever man of the children of Israel, verse 13, or the stranger who sojourns among you, who hunts and catches any animal or bird, that it may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood, and cover it with dust. That is a law for the Gentiles as well as for Israel. Because the Gentiles are to be grafted into the house of Israel and to learn how to live righteously. And the priests are to teach them the statutes of God. I've shared that with you in the past. I'm just showing you one more of the scores of instances like this. They would cover it with dust, verse 14, for it is the life of all flesh. Its blood sustains its life. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, you shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is in the blood. Whoever eats it will be cut off. But also, it says to cover it, to bury it. And every person who eats what died naturally, or what was torn by beasts, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he would be unclean until evening. But if he doesn't wash his clothes, if he doesn't bathe his body, then he would bear his iniquity. That's to the Gentile as well as to the Jew. God's statutes are applicable to the Gentiles. They don't need to be circumcised because that was a ceremonial. They don't need to be considered unclean. That's all the ceremonial things have all been paid for. But the laws that regulate our conduct and our worship towards God and our conduct with one another, they are for all mankind. They are a gift and they are a blessing. Of course, we don't keep them perfectly, but that's what we have the precious blood of Yeshua for. His mercy endures forever, and we have atonement. But we don't consider mercy a license, do we? We don't consider grace license to sin. That would be the doctrine of Balaam and the Nicolaitans it talks about in Revelation chapter 2. We want no part of that. So I think that's good. Then we finished off in chapter 17. So next time we're coming into the good part. Chapter 18 is coming up really close. 19 is my favorite. A lot of good statutes. So next time we continue in Torah, that's where we'll pick it up.